Margaret Miller stood before her mirror, brushing silver strands of hair into place, humming softly as the scent of roast chicken filled her kitchen. Friday dinners with her daughter Jessica were her favorite ritual, comforting, predictable, and filled with family warmth. But as she reached for her pearl earrings, her phone buzzed. A message from her lawyer, Samantha Chen, appeared in stark black letters. "Call me immediately." A cold tremor ran through her. Lawyers didn't send messages like that unless something was terribly wrong. She dialed without hesitation, her voice shaking. "Sam, is everything okay?" Silence crackled before Samantha exhaled sharply. "Margaret, I need you to sit down." Margaret's knees weakened. Saturday. "I reviewed your financial portfolio this morning, and something isn't right. Your retirement account is almost empty." "What?" "That's impossible. Jessica manages my finances. Edward trusted her after he passed. She said everything was growing." Samantha's tone dropped. "Margaret, your daughter has been siphoning money, over $3 million in the past 2 years. Forged statements, fake investment reports. She's covered her tracks well. But I found them." The world tilted. Her daughter? Jessica? The same child she'd nursed through fevers, the girl who cried when her goldfish died, who'd stood at her father's grave promising to take care of Mom. Margaret's heart pounded. Betrayal burned through her veins like fire. "What do I do?" she whispered. Samantha's voice softened. "For now, act normal. Go to dinner. Don't confront her yet. We need evidence. If she suspects you know, she'll move or hide the rest." Margaret nodded, her reflection now a stranger, an aging woman staring into the eyes of someone who'd been deceived by her own blood. That night, she drove through Denver's glowing skyline, past manicured lawns and luxury homes. Jessica's mansion loomed ahead, elegant and modern, a palace built with stolen dreams. Jessica greeted her at the door with a radiant smile. "Mom, you look lovely." Margaret forced a smile, her chest tight. "Thank you, dear. Smells wonderful." Inside, everything screamed opulence. Marble counters, expensive wine, abstract art, the faint scent of designer perfume. Her son-in-law Tom laughed from the kitchen, pouring drinks. "Jessica just landed a new contract," he said proudly. "We might expand to Aspen next quarter." Margaret smiled politely. Inside, rage simmered. Every sip of wine, every compliment, felt like swallowing glass. Jessica leaned across the table, touching her hand. "Mom, about your accounts, I've been meaning to discuss some new options. Safer ones, you know? I'll handle the paperwork." Margaret's nails dug into her palm beneath the tablecloth. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied smoothly. "You've always been so capable." Jessica's smile widened. She had no idea. After dinner, Margaret stepped outside to get some air. Her eyes swept over the Porsche in the driveway, the same color Edward once dreamed of owning but never bought. She whispered into the cool night air, "You'll pay for this, Jessica. But not how you think." Inside her heart, the engineer's mind that once designed bridges began constructing something else, a plan for justice. When your own child steals your future, what would you do? Expose them, or outsmart them? Stay with me, because what Margaret does next will leave you breathless. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us where you're streaming from. Margaret spent the night staring at her ceiling. Every tick of the clock echoed like a countdown. By morning, grief had hardened into resolve. At Samantha's office, she met Chloe Armstrong, a forensic accountant with an analytical mind and an unshakable calm. Chloe laid out files, charts, and printouts. Jessica used shell accounts, Elysian Designs LLC, to funnel your funds. Most of it's tied to a resort investment in Mexico. It's failing. Samantha added, "We'll gather everything quietly. You'll need to pretend nothing's wrong." Margaret's mouth went dry. "So I keep pretending to trust her." "Exactly," said Samantha. "Play her game until we have proof." That night, Margaret returned to Jessica's for brunch, masking her fury beneath motherly warmth. She listened as Jessica bragged about her firm's success, each lie polished like glass. Tom clinked his glass. "To family," he said, smirking. Margaret forced a smile, thinking, family doesn't rob you blind. Over the next week, she planted small questions, testing Jessica's reactions. When she mentioned moving her funds to a different firm, Jessica's voice sharpened instantly. "Mom, don't do anything rash. You're not good with numbers. Just let me handle it." Margaret nodded sweetly, memorizing every word. Meanwhile, Chloe's reports grew thicker: proof of falsified documents, transfers in Tom's name, luxury purchases under Jessica's firm card. The image of her daughter as a loving caregiver was disintegrating into a portrait of greed. But the moment that broke her came one evening, when Margaret found an old voicemail from Jessica. "Mom, don't worry. I'll protect what Dad built. I promise." Tears burned her cheeks. She whispered, "You protected yourself, not us." But Margaret wasn't done pretending. The trap was only beginning. Stay tuned for Chapter 3, where a fake house sale becomes the key to the perfect revenge. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. The next morning, Margaret stood by her kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves swirl across her lawn. Samantha's plan was now in motion, Operation Quiet Justice, as she called it. The goal wasn't just to expose Jessica. It was to let Jessica expose herself. Chloe's forensic report sat open on the table, a mountain of proof connecting Jessica's luxurious life to Margaret's empty accounts. But Samantha wanted one final piece, something emotional, undeniable, something that would make Jessica act impulsively. That's when Samantha said the words that changed everything. "We'll make her believe you're selling the house." Margaret blinked. "Sell my house? But why?" Samantha smiled. "Because greedy people panic when their inheritance disappears." The setup was simple but brilliant. They'd leak a rumor through Arthur Gable, a well-known Denver gossip who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. Margaret would tell him she was thinking of selling her beloved family home and moving to a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. Arthur would do the rest. By evening, the bait was in the water. 2 days later, Jessica called, her voice tight and frantic. "Mom, I just heard from Arthur that you're selling the house? Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret played innocent. "Oh, Arthur talks too much. I was only thinking about it, dear. This old place feels too big for me." "Mom, you can't. That house means everything to Dad's memory. You shouldn't make rash decisions." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm just getting old, sweetheart. Hard to think straight sometimes." Jessica paused, her tone softening into fake sympathy. "It's okay, Mom. I'll help you. Let's meet this weekend, all right? We'll go over your options." "Of course, darling," Margaret said sweetly, hanging up. Then her eyes hardened. The hook was set. On Saturday, Jessica and Tom arrived, tension wrapped around them like fog. They brought wine and practiced smiles. Margaret had placed a small decorative birdhouse on the porch, a charming little trinket with one secret, a voice recorder hidden inside. As they sat in the living room, Jessica fidgeted, her eyes darting to every corner. "Mom, I really think you're under a lot of stress. Maybe we should get you some help. A doctor, perhaps." Margaret tilted her head. "You think I need help? Just someone to make sure you're thinking clearly." Tom chimed in, "You've been through so much, Margaret. Losing Edward, all this talk about selling the house, it's understandable." Margaret smiled gently. "You're both so thoughtful." After an hour, she excused herself to fetch dessert. In the kitchen, she listened through the wall as Jessica whispered sharply, "She's slipping, Tom. This is perfect. I'll call Dr. Miller next week and get her tested. Once we have that evaluation, the conservatorship will be ours. Then we can control everything." Tom hesitated. "Jess, this is going too far." Jessica hissed, "Don't get soft now. That house is worth a fortune. Once she's declared incompetent, it's ours. Everything is." Margaret gripped the counter. Tears welled, not from sadness, but from a cold, righteous fury. She had her proof. That night, Samantha listened to the recording in stunned silence. "She just dug her own grave," she said quietly. The daughter thought she was winning. But the mother had already started her counterattack. Don't miss Chapter 4, where Margaret's heartbreak turns into a courtroom war. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us where you're streaming from. A week later, an envelope arrived at Margaret's door. The heading froze her blood: Petition for Conservatorship of Margaret Miller. Jessica had filed it officially, backed by sworn statements from her business partners and a psychologist, Dr. Alan Miller, who claimed Margaret exhibited signs of cognitive decline. Margaret sat at her table, trembling, her fingers tracing the words. Her own daughter had declared her incompetent. When she called Samantha, her voice broke. She really did it. My daughter wants to take my life from me while I'm still breathing. Samantha's tone was steady. Good. This is her fatal mistake. We'll expose everything in court. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared meticulously. Chloe finished a detailed report linking every fraudulent transfer to Jessica's accounts. Samantha drafted legal filings citing Colorado's elder financial abuse statute. But the emotional toll was brutal. Margaret had to endure whispers from neighbors who thought she was losing her mind. Jessica's lies spread fast. At night, Margaret walked through her home, touching framed photos, Jessica at 6 in her ballet costume, Jessica's wedding, Edward's smile frozen in memory. I'm sorry, Edward, she whispered. I failed to see what she became. But Edward's photo seemed to remind her. She was still the woman who built bridges, who solved impossible problems. She wasn't going down quietly. The day of the hearing arrived. The Denver courthouse buzzed with reporters. Jessica appeared in an elegant cream suit, her makeup flawless, her expression serene. She looked like the perfect daughter, calm, caring, and composed. Margaret, in contrast, wore a simple blue dress and pearls. But when she entered the courtroom beside Samantha, heads turned. She radiated quiet strength. Jessica's lawyer painted her as a loving daughter concerned for her mother's well-being. Witnesses lied under oath, describing Margaret as confused and forgetful. Then Samantha stood. She began with Dr. Evelyn Reed, an independent psychiatrist who had evaluated Margaret. Dr. Reed smiled at the judge. Mrs. Miller's cognitive function is entirely normal. She is lucid, logical, and remarkably sharp for her age. Jessica's face tightened. Then came Chloe. Her report filled the courtroom screen, a flowchart of money trails, forged documents, and shell accounts. Finally, Samantha said, Your Honor, this is an audio recording captured during a private conversation between the petitioner and her husband. The room fell silent. Jessica's voice echoed through the speakers. Once she's declared incompetent, it's ours. Everything is. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's face drained of color. Tom buried his head in his hands. The truth was out, but the storm wasn't over. What came next would destroy everything Jessica built. Stay tuned for Chapter 5, where betrayal meets justice. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us where you're streaming from. Jessica's perfect facade shattered like glass. Reporters whispered, cameras flashed, and the judge's gavel struck once, demanding silence. Samantha rose for closing arguments. This is not a case about confusion. It is a case about betrayal, by a daughter who stole from her own mother and father, and who sought to strip her of her dignity under the guise of love. She turned to Margaret. Mrs. Miller trusted her daughter completely. That trust was weaponized against her. Jessica's lawyer stammered weak defenses, claiming misunderstanding, stress, accounting errors. But the evidence was undeniable. Then the judge spoke, voice heavy with authority. The court finds the petition for conservatorship not only unfounded but fraudulent. Furthermore, this court orders an immediate freeze of all assets belonging to Jessica and Thomas Harper, pending criminal investigation. Jessica gasped, reaching for Tom, who sat stone-faced. Margaret closed her eyes. Relief washed over her, not triumphant, but bittersweet. As she left the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. Mrs. Miller, what will you do now? She paused on the courthouse steps. I'll rebuild. Slowly, honestly, the way life should be lived. Months later, spring sunlight streamed through her garden as Leo, her grandson, ran across the yard. Margaret handed him an envelope, the Leo Miller Educational Trust, restored in full. He hugged her tightly. Grandma, you're amazing. Margaret smiled softly. No, darling. I just stopped pretending. As she watched him play, peace finally returned. Justice had taken time, but it came, patient, quiet, and perfect. Would you have done the same if your own child betrayed you? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. And remember, Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply living free again. The verdict had been read, the gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied. But for Margaret Miller, the sound of that gavel kept echoing in her head like a clock ticking through her memories. She stood by her car in the courthouse parking lot, gripping her purse with trembling hands. The cool Denver wind cut through her coat, but she barely felt it. Samantha approached, her voice soft. "It's over, Margaret. You did it." Margaret smiled faintly. "Is it really over, Sam? I still lost my daughter." Samantha hesitated. "You didn't lose her, Margaret. She lost you." As Margaret drove home, the victory felt hollow. Her house, once filled with laughter and family dinners, felt like a museum of betrayal. The photo of Jessica and Tom on the mantel mocked her now, two smiling faces that had drained her life savings and nearly taken her freedom. That night, Margaret sat by her fireplace, sipping tea that had long gone cold. She replayed Jessica's courtroom collapse in her mind. The tears, the denial, the shock, it wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was grief. The next morning, Samantha called with updates. The DA has opened a criminal investigation. Jessica and Tom's accounts are frozen. Their cars, the Denver mansion, everything's under review. Margaret nodded. "And Leo?" Samantha smiled. "Safe and sound. His educational trust is reinstated." "You did that." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a flicker of peace. She decided to visit Leo that afternoon. When he saw her, his face lit up. "Grandma, Mom said you were mad at her." Margaret's heart sank. "Oh, sweetheart, grown-ups make mistakes. Sometimes big ones." Leo hugged her tightly. "I'm glad you're okay." Margaret kissed the top of his head. "Me too, darling. Me too." But as she looked over his shoulder, she saw Jessica's house in the distance, its blinds closed, its driveway empty. The silence felt heavier than anger. Weeks turned into months. The case made local headlines: daughter charged in elder fraud case. Friends and neighbors called, offering sympathy. Some whispered gossip, others brought casseroles. But Margaret wanted none of it. She spent her days gardening, rebuilding the small routines that made her feel human again. Still, at night, she would wake to memories. Jessica at 6 years old, begging her father for a bedtime story. Edward smiling as he watched them both. Now both were gone, one to the grave, the other to greed. She whispered into the dark, "You can take my money, Jessica, but you can't take my peace anymore." The courtroom victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a deeper reckoning. Stay tuned for Chapter 7, The Cracks in the Mask. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. Jessica's once perfect life began to crumble faster than anyone expected. Her luxury car repossessed. Her design firm, Elysian Designs LLC, flagged for fraud. Clients pulled out, and creditors circled like vultures. Margaret followed the fallout only through the news. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply watched the daughter she once adored dissolve under the weight of her own lies. But Jessica wasn't done fighting. One afternoon, Samantha called. Jessica's lawyer just filed for a plea bargain. She's claiming diminished responsibility, mental strain from her father's death. Margaret's voice turned cold. Mental strain didn't make her forge my husband's signature. Greed did. Still, Samantha urged calm. "Let the system handle it, Margaret. Don't get pulled into her storm." But that night, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was Jessica. "Mom, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Margaret's pulse raced. "Jessica, you nearly destroyed me. I was trying to protect what was ours. Tom pressured me. The business was collapsing. I just needed time. By stealing from your father's grave." Margaret's voice trembled. "You stole from your own son." Jessica's silence was heavy. "I know. I'll fix it, Mom. Please don't hate me." Margaret hung up. There were no words left. The next day, Chloe visited with new findings. "We found offshore accounts." She was planning to move the last of your funds to a resort in Tulum. Margaret shook her head slowly. So even after the trial, she was still hiding money. Chloe nodded. "People like Jessica don't stop. They just change tactics." Margaret sat in silence. Her daughter was gone, consumed by greed and guilt. Later that evening, Margaret stood in her garden, pruning roses. She whispered to herself, "She'll learn. One way or another, she'll learn." The daughter was cornered, but a cornered liar can still strike back. Coming next, Chapter 8, Shadows and Confessions. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. 3 months passed before Jessica finally agreed to meet her mother face to face. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Denver. When Margaret arrived, Jessica looked nothing like the glamorous designer she once was. Her hair hung loose, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. "Mom," she began softly, "I wanted to apologize." Margaret sat across from her, expression unreadable. "Go ahead." Jessica swallowed hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing. After Dad died, I panicked. You were so lost, I thought. I thought I could help. But then the money came, and I couldn't stop." Margaret's eyes glistened. "Help? You took everything your father worked for. Everything I trusted you with." Tears rolled down Jessica's cheeks. "I know. And I'm sorry. They're talking about prison time, Mom. I don't know what to do." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Jessica's. "You'll do what's right. You'll face what you did." Jessica's sobs broke through the cafe's quiet hum. Margaret stood to leave. "You need to remember something, Jessica. I may forgive you one day, but that doesn't mean you deserve it." As she walked out, she didn't look back. Forgiveness was offered, but not freedom. Next, in Chapter 9, The Price of Peace, justice finds its final balance. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The legal process dragged on. Jessica accepted a plea deal, 5 years probation, full restitution, and community service. Tom left her, taking what little remained of their crumbling business. Margaret didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. Instead, she sat by Edward's grave, a single rose in her hand. "It's done, Edward. Justice, at least the kind this world allows." Wind rustled through the cemetery trees. For the first time, Margaret felt something close to peace. Back home, she focused on restoring Leo's trust fund and teaching him the values his mother had forgotten: honesty, patience, and responsibility. "Grandma," Leo said one evening, "will Mom ever come home?" Margaret looked at the setting sun. "Maybe one day. But not until she learns what home really means." Justice had been served, but the soul still needed healing. Next comes Chapter 10, Spring's Redemption. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. A year later, spring returned to Denver. Margaret's garden was in full bloom, tulips, daisies, and roses bursting with color. Leo ran through the yard, his laughter echoing off the walls of a house that had once been filled with pain. Margaret smiled as she watered her plants. She had rebuilt her life, not through vengeance, but through quiet persistence. Jessica had completed her restitution payments and now volunteered at a local shelter. She sent Margaret a letter every month. Sometimes Margaret read them. Sometimes she didn't. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived. Inside was a photo, Jessica and Leo together, smiling. On the back, a single line: "Thank you for not giving up on me." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. The wound was still there, but it no longer controlled her. As she stood in her blooming garden, she whispered to the wind, "Edward, we made it through." Betrayal broke her heart, but truth rebuilt her life. Would you have had Margaret's patience, or her revenge? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're streaming from. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that crushes the air out of the lungs. Margaret sat beside Samantha, hands clasped tightly, as Jessica entered with Tom, her lawyer, and their entourage of false witnesses. The tension felt thick enough to choke on. Judge Keller presided, known for her sharp wit and intolerance for deceit. Jessica's attorney began the hearing with charm and theatrics, portraying her as a devoted daughter concerned for her aging mother's welfare. He painted Margaret as confused, unstable, and emotionally unfit to handle her affairs. Margaret remained composed, eyes fixed on Jessica. Every lie felt like another knife twisting into the wound of betrayal, yet she'd promised herself she wouldn't flinch. When Samantha rose for cross-examination, her tone was precise, calculated. Mrs. Miller, could you tell the court how you came to believe your mother was mentally incompetent? Jessica hesitated, but her lawyer nodded. She was making erratic decisions. Talking about selling her home. Forgetting where she put things. Samantha smiled faintly. And did you provide the court with a psychological evaluation? Yes, Jessica replied confidently. From Dr. Alan Miller. Jessica nodded again. Samantha lifted a document. Your Honor, this is the invoice for that evaluation, paid for directly by Elysian Designs LLC. The same company that received unauthorized wire transfers from Mrs. Miller's accounts. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Jessica's color drained. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Miller, is that true? Jessica stammered. I don't recall the details. Samantha pressed on. And would you care to explain why that company also financed your husband's resort investment in Mexico? Margaret's heart pounded. Chloe stepped forward with the evidence. Bank records, wire transfers, shell company documentation. One by one, Samantha built a chain of truth that tightened around Jessica like a noose. Then, Samantha gestured toward Margaret. My client is not a confused woman. She's a victim of financial abuse, from her own daughter. When Chloe displayed the forensic flowchart on a large monitor, the courtroom gasped again. Every dollar stolen was mapped in red, traced directly to Jessica and Tom. Finally, Samantha played the recording from the birdhouse, Jessica's voice cold and calculating. Once she's declared incompetent, I'll have full control. The house, the accounts, everything. Jessica froze. Tom's eyes widened in horror. The room erupted in whispers. When the recording ended, Judge Keller's gavel slammed down. Order in the court. She turned toward Jessica. Mrs. Miller, I've heard enough. Hook, ending. As Jessica's world crumbled, Margaret sat motionless, tears streaming silently. Her daughter, the child she raised, fed, and trusted, had just destroyed herself with her own greed. Stay tuned, because the verdict that follows will change everything. Tell us where you're streaming from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for the next chapter of When I Was Getting Ready to Go to My Daughter's for Dinner. Judge Keller reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. The air was heavy with anticipation. Jessica avoided Margaret's gaze, trembling slightly as her attorney whispered frantically. After reviewing the evidence, the judge began, It is clear that Mrs. Jessica Hart engaged in deliberate financial misconduct and elder abuse under the guise of legal guardianship. Jessica's lawyer stood. Your Honor. Sit down, Keller ordered sharply. Tom's head sank into his hands. Samantha's expression remained unreadable, calm but fierce. Mrs. Hart, the judge continued, this court denies your conservatorship petition. Furthermore, I am freezing all assets under your and your husband's names pending a criminal investigation by the district attorney's office. A murmur spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled notes. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering, Edward, we did it. Jessica erupted. You can't do this to me. I'm her daughter. Everything I did was to protect her. Judge Keller's voice sliced through the chaos. Protection? You forged insurance documents, diverted trust funds meant for your own son, and defrauded your mother of $3 million. Jessica sobbed uncontrollably as officers approached to escort her out for questioning. Tom, defeated, muttered, I didn't know, Maggie. I swear I didn't know. Margaret looked at him, and for a brief moment, saw genuine remorse. But it was too late. As the gavel fell one final time, Margaret's tears were no longer of pain. They were of justice finally delivered. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded her. One asked, Mrs. Miller, what do you want people to take from your story? Margaret smiled sadly. Trust is precious, but blind trust can destroy everything you love. Margaret won the case, but revenge doesn't end in court. Because justice doesn't heal, and forgiveness doesn't come easy. Don't go anywhere, the reckoning isn't over yet. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Chapter 13 is where the truth comes home. The snow had melted into spring by the time Margaret returned to her quiet Denver home. The walls felt different, lighter, freer, as though the house itself had exhaled after years of tension. Her phone buzzed. A message from Chloe. Charges filed. Jessica and Tom's accounts are frozen. The DA's office wants to interview you next week. Margaret stared at the text. Justice was still unfolding, but she felt no triumph, only an aching emptiness. She brewed tea and sat by the window, thinking of Jessica as a child, building Lego towers beside her father. Where did that innocence go? Later, Samantha visited. "You've been incredible through all of this," she said. "Most people would have broken." Margaret smiled faintly. "You don't break when you've already lost everything." They discussed the next steps: restitution, asset recovery, Leo's trust restoration. Samantha promised to ensure Margaret recovered what was rightfully hers. As night fell, Margaret found an old photo: Jessica, Edward, and little Leo at the beach. She ran her fingers across it, whispering, "I still love you, Jess, but you made your choice." Meanwhile, across town, Jessica sat in her empty house, stripped of luxury, awaiting indictment. Her calls went unanswered. Tom had left. Her world, once gilded with deceit, now stood in ruin. Margaret may have reclaimed her money, but what about her peace? Sometimes, the hardest part of revenge isn't the fight, it's living with the aftermath. If you're still with us, hit subscribe, drop a comment about where you're watching from, and prepare for Chapter 14, The Restoration. Margaret's garden came alive again, tulips, daisies, and roses blooming in harmony. She found solace in nurturing life after years of betrayal. One morning, Leo arrived holding a bouquet. "Grandma," he said softly, "Mom wrote to me from jail. She said she's sorry." Margaret paused. "Do you believe her?" Leo hesitated. "I want to. But I also know what she did." Margaret handed him a sealed envelope. "This is yours, the Leo Miller Educational Trust. Your grandfather wanted you to have it." Tears filled Leo's eyes. "You did all this for me." She smiled. "For you, and for truth." Samantha called later with good news: partial recovery of the stolen funds, plus court-ordered restitution. The Mexican resort was liquidated. Proceeds were redirected to Margaret's accounts. As the sun set, Margaret sat on the porch, the wind whispering through the trees. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. She had lost her daughter, but found her strength. And sometimes, that's the truest form of revenge. Stay tuned for the final chapter, the one where peace finally arrives. Don't forget to like, share, and tell us where you're streaming from. Months later, Margaret walked through her garden barefoot, feeling the earth beneath her feet. She had survived heartbreak, deception, and humiliation, and come out stronger. The news had spread across Denver: elder woman outsmarts daughter in $3 million fraud case. Strangers mailed her letters of support, calling her a symbol of resilience. Leo visited often now, helping her plant new flowers. They laughed again, just as they had before everything fell apart. One evening, Margaret stood at Edward's grave. She placed fresh lilies and whispered, "We kept your promise, my love." The truth won. Her phone buzzed, a message from Samantha. Case closed. Jessica accepted a plea deal. 2 years, restitution complete. Margaret sighed, not in relief, but in closure. "It's over," she murmured. She turned back toward home, the sun painting the sky in shades of gold. As she reached her porch, Leo called out, "Grandma, dinner's ready." Margaret smiled. For the first time in years, she felt whole again. She looked into the camera, calm, wise, unbroken. "If you're listening to my story," she said softly, "remember, revenge isn't about hate. It's about reclaiming what was stolen from you, and never letting betrayal define you." Thank you for joining this journey. If you felt Margaret's strength, drop a comment about where you're streaming from, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories of truth, justice, and redemption. Because sometimes, revenge is just another word for freedom.